So we're moving with some level of ambiguity. I made an error, seemingly an error, in the last recording, insofar as I did not distinguish the core freedom in Kant, freedom as spontaneity, from freedom for. And somebody like Isaiah Berlin, you can see more clearly the difference between freedom for and freedom from, such as being locked up in chains and needing freedom from the chains, whereas freedom for would be you're already free, and then somebody offers you, then employment is offered in different places, for instance, and you have freedom for choosing the different manners of employment, for instance. But there's a deep ambiguity in that, in the tradition, insofar as what the tradition is concerned with is the difficulty of I'm going to try to do this in another recording, the difference between free will and free choice, between voluntas and arbitrium. Arbitrium linking up to the ego arbiter, our inner arbitration. But in the tradition, the difficulty is, how does the will and intelligibility link together, especially in the sense of the tripartite Platonic soul, but in general in the sense of when we have things intelligible to us, say in the form that the categorical imperative allows us to lay things out for us that we can understand them, then how does the will come in and will the freedom for those maxims to be carried out? And what's the relationship between, can we know something? And this whole thing of, in Socrates insists that to know is, and arete, or virtue, have to go together. And then in the Christian Middle Ages, around the time of Thomas, they would say you get all kinds of confusion on that point. And then the concept of free will comes in and replaces the idea of the ego arbiter, being of the so-called free choice. And then it's like there's a situation where there's all kinds of confusions over the new concept of the conscience, and whether even knowing what's right. And then there gets to be more and more this sense that what's right is known, but one simply doesn't will to do it out of different forms of deficiencies of character and so on. So there is, in some way, a fundamental ambiguity with respect to the difference between spontaneous freedom, the ultimate freedom to directly intuit what the right way to live is, out of the teleological nature of the world, so that there's one right form of life, remembering that a form of life is something totally tangible, like the form of life of the ancient Egyptians during the reign of a certain pharaoh, for instance, how they lived then. If one form of life can be the right form of life, in detail, for instance, the whole discussion in Kant, where everybody disagrees with Kant on the point of that human beings should never lie, and there's a whole literature on that point. But this would be one of the details of the right way to live, which would be we'd spontaneously grasp it with our will, and with the higher part, with the part that corresponds to arete, let's say, to virtue. We'd spontaneously grasp that, but then it would become intelligible to us because we'd spell it out to ourselves in a maxim using the form of the categorical imperative. So what I'm trying to get to is freedom in Heidegger, or what is freedom in Heidegger in contradistinction to the whole tradition. So remembering that Leo Strauss makes the division between the immature Neitzsche, which we're dealing with here in the second essay, and the mature Neitzsche. Neitzsche enriches and changes and brings in all kinds of other things later on. But from this point of view, it's convenient for us to understand the the highest form of freedom in Nietzsche as the eternal reoccurrence of the same, or however you want to translate that. The eternal reoccurrence of the same we could understand then by reading the first section of Nietzsche's essay and seeing that we pass the criterion of grasping the whole situation, and then we say, even though these guys like Leopardi are correct, and there is no, the thing that Kant was searching for does not exist, there is no one right way to live, we're going to eternally will that there be a right way to live. So we actively produce this thing which in Kant is being spontaneously received out of nature. All this brings us into the creativity. So then we could say on one side there's, and it reminds of Goethe's phrase of I dislike anything that doesn't quicken my activity, remembering that Goethe basically dismissed the whole of science in the sense of one must have something that stands there, like the concept of a tree, for instance, so that you can then lodge all your knowledge about trees under that concept. Whereas Goethe says everything is constantly in flux. When I observe nature, there's nothing that stands still. Everything's in a morphological flux. It's impossible to have the science in the sense that say the ancient understanding of the biological taxonomy, which was not merely a formal understanding, but a human being really was discovered. The formal category of a human being is to discover a real spot of real knowledge of something which is eternal. Because even if human beings aren't right now living in the form that Goethe can observe them changing, the idea is always there in the mind of nature or God, or however you want to say it. And Aristotle even denies the creation, that the world was ever created in the full sense, whereas the Christians claim that there was a creation ex nihilo. But that's just a complication. All of this comes in with the idea that the motive is lacking, that you can ever say what is the purpose of anything becomes like Voltaire's question of the nose is there so the glasses can sit on them. Remembering that Voltaire was still in a much more confused state than we've reached in Nietzsche's time, because of the reason that Voltaire still thought that something like the eyes had a teleology. The eyes were there for a purpose, but not just any old conventional invention of human beings. Could be said to have an ultimate purpose in relation to that the human was there waiting for cell phones, for instance, that we're such a being that was built for cell phones. So there's still a sort of a halfway house situation there, where it wasn't fully admitted that nothing, even the eyes, even human beings with regard to a state of health, had a purpose that could be discerned scientifically. So you can see this region of freedom in Nietzsche is extremely far-reaching. At the other hand, it may be unfair to Nietzsche in the sense that it's not as though Nietzsche is just on a whim saying this is how we should understand things, but the problems are there for him. He's been thrown into a certain situation, and then he creatively tackles it. It comes up, faces the situation, and in a way this is the meaning of prudence properly. He tackles the situation and comes up with solutions, and here they are. And his solution is this possibility of the eternal occurrence of the same. And I know that some other people have ideas about that, but one should be cautious of pet theories and not, let's say, not very painfully cutting off even one's own nose, if it's be healthier to do that, I suppose. But and of course, it's true, any thinker can only go by what appears manifestly evident to them. And therefore, when something appears manifestly evident, then there's nothing else we can really do, except I suppose we would have to make a leap of faith in the case that Heidegger said something that made no sense to us, but then we think Heidegger might really know something, and then maybe we would jump off in another direction. That's possible. Okay, so that's what that's what the tradition is about with regard to freedom. The ultimate freedom is really freedom to obey the teleology, and then that's split in modern times between whether there's one teleology or whether the pursuit of happiness actually points to innumerable teleologies for each individual or each small sector. And then I'll just make one sort of sociological remark, which is that in the current situation, this is obscured by the fact that although we live in individualist society, what that really means in de facto is that everyone is exposed to the same ideological assaults, but we're all exposed as individuals, and therefore we can't resist them, and therefore the great majority of people join political parties or in some way inwardly admit to the authority of certain ideas, because otherwise you're completely trammeled. So for instance, here we are admitting the authority of the Heideggerian tradition, which is one supposed way out of the what Heidegger sees as the underlining form. Taking Nietzsche's way of thinking, the underlying form of all planetary life is the pursuit of techne. That's the primary reason that we're prolonging our existence on the earth, is the pursuit of techne, and you can see that that's really the primary activity of human beings, especially when we understand that in terms of the Weltbild, in terms of harnessing the energy of all things, including ourselves, to the tune of various projects. So in the next time we're going to try to I think I have a way of giving more tangibility to seeing the way Heidegger sees freedom